In this section, I will do something quite different from the other sections. I will not introduce any new patterns. Instead, I will compare a few patterns that designers often confuse to help you name and select the right pattern for your design problem. In the previous sections, we've seen a few patterns that at first glance look quite similar. In all of these patterns, we introduce some object that sits in between the client and the target object. The client invokes a method on the introduced object, and then the introduced object forwards the message to the intended target. The introduced objects may execute some code before and after. These patterns rely on a concept called delegation, and there are at least 4 of these patterns that I've often seen designers confuse. The 4 patterns that we covered that are often confused are called proxy, decorator, adapter, and facade. Some are more commonly confused than others. If we make a comparison table, it's easy, at least at first glance, to see how some of them can get confused. Let's first take a look at what the object structure might look like at runtime. First, we have the proxy, where a client wants to talk to a real object, but it does through a proxy. And that proxy may forward to another proxy, so we might have a chain of proxy before we get to the real object. Although it's rare that we have multiple proxy, it can occur. What is interesting here is that the client often have no idea that it's working through a proxy, and that the real object and the proxies often have identical interfaces. When we look at the decorator, it also looks very similar in the object structure. What a client does is it typically talks through an object that we call a decorator and forwards to another decorator, perhaps before we get to the real object. And at first glance, these seem identical, and that's also why they're most often confused. But the decorator here is a little bit different, as we'll discuss. First of all, often the client knows that it's talking to a decorator. It might actually be the one that instantiated the decorator. Looking at the runtime object graph for an adapter, we see that the client goes through an object before it gets to some other object again. We call the first object they interact with an adapter, and often what they're talking to is some legacy component or some component whose interface doesn't quite match what the client wants to see. So we can clearly see here that there is at least one difference between the proxy and the decorator, that the interface to the client is different from the object that the adapter adapts. So the client has an expectation of an interface that is different from the one that is on the object that has the implementation. Now finally, we have the facade, which is quite different than the others. We have an object that forwards to a set of other objects. There's someone that is basically simplifying an object graph. Next, let's take a look at what it looks like in the class structure for these 4 different patterns. The proxy pattern, a client uses some component interface. It may be using a proxy, it may be using the real, the client doesn't really know. Typically the proxy and the real object implement the same interface, and the proxy has some reference to another component interface, which may be the real or another proxy. When it comes to the decorator, it looks almost identical to the proxy in the class diagram. We have a client interface, we have some real object that we want to decorate, and we have a set of decorators then forwards to the client interface. It's typically part of a framework that the client knows about, and we exposes to the client the various variations of decorators that we have. We can clearly see some differences in the adapter to the decorator and proxy. A client uses a component interface implemented by an adapter, but that adapter forwards to another component that is typically not related to the client interface or the component interface by inheritance at least. And looking at the class diagram for a facade, we clearly see that that's very different. A client uses a facade that may have been one of the domain objects, but often it's an introduced object, and the facade then forwards to a set of other objects, and it's trying to hide the complexity of the underlying implementation from the client. Although it's very difficult to see the difference between the proxy and the decorator, the adapter and facade has some clear differences. The adapter has this association to a LC here, legacy component typically, that is not linked through inheritance, it's simply a forwarding mechanism. So we can clearly see that that is different from the other patterns. And on the facade, we see that the client uses a single object that then forwards to multiple objects, which we couldn't see in the other object, or typically a single other recipient from the object introduced between the client and the implementation. So just to summarize, when it comes to the facade, the difference is usually clear as soon as people think about it a little bit. The goal here is to hide a complex structure and make it easy for the client to use a framework or a complex object graph. The adapter may be slightly more difficult to see. The difference here is that the client is using a different interface than the actual implementation, and it's about translation of interfaces. Coming to grasp with the differences between the proxy and the decorator pattern is much harder. What we can say about this is that the decorator is often part of a framework where the client is aware of the design. They may be the one that instantiate the decorator, they may be the one attaching it. But that's not always the case. Sometimes the components themselves introduce the decorator, but it's often much more clear to the client what is happening. In the proxy case, what we're usually trying to do is we're trying to hide the proxies from the client, where the client is using an interface that is clear to them, in most cases not even aware of the fact that the proxy is sitting in between them and the real. And it could be to do remote communication, it could be to check security, for instance, things that we don't necessarily want to implement on the real object nor on the client. And there's often also a single proxy involved. While I drew the comparison table, we saw that the facade and the adapter patterns are quite different. However, the difference between the proxy and decorator patterns are harder to spot. Perhaps they should have been the same pattern. Some designers would argue for that. But I think the Gang of Four did an excellent job in picking the patterns and arguing for why one is different from the other. It is my experience that having both patterns and being able to distinguish between them is quite useful when discussing with other designers. There have been cases in my design when I introduced frameworks where the proxies and decorators are mixed. But when I do, I try to name the classes that implement them decorators or proxy based on their main purpose. The following table shows how I make the distinction. One dimension is if the client is involved in the creation or construction of the delegator. In the case of proxies, it's usually my goal to make sure that the client doesn't know that it's using a proxy, or I try to introduce it without their knowledge. In the case of the decorator, that's not always true. Often by design, I allow the clients to add decorators. So the typical purpose of the proxy is to overcome some main hurdle that neither the client and the target should be aware of. This could be, for instance, distribution, where we have a remote proxy. It could be a security, where we need something to be checked. But we don't want the ones that implement the service to have to deal with security or distribution, nor do we want the client to worry about this. In the case of the decorator, it is more a goal to implement orthogonal concerns that are usable across a set of components as part of a framework. At least this is my guideline. Others may have slightly different guidelines. It probably is a good idea for you to go back and reread the patterns in the book, or also see discussions online of how people separate the proxy and decorator. There are differences in opinion here. This is my decision table.